If you've spent any time studying Western music theory, it doesn't take very long to realize that the major scale is probably the most fundamental structure in it. The names of notes are based on the structure of the major scale. We name all of our intervals in relation to the major scale, and the relationships between the notes in the major scale are fundamental to the way we understand harmony. This is usually presented as a given, but I've always wanted to know what makes the major scale in particular so important. The full scope of this will probably be the length of a dissertation, but I'm going to try to show you how I started to think about this and a few of the patterns I first noticed. Eventually, I want to make as much of the complexity of this as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, but this first effort will assume a decent amount of pre-existing musical knowledge.
So let's take a look at a piano and see what we're working with here. Now, if you look here, we have 88 notes on a piano. But they're not really 88 different notes. There's actually, we only really think of them as 12 unique notes. And that's because the first concept I want to introduce is the concept of an octave. And what's interesting about octaves is that perceptually we kind of find an identity between notes at certain regular intervals, right? You can tell that this is higher than this, but it also sounds the same in a certain way. So there's a circularity that occurs as we go up in frequency, and as it happens, that actually happens to be double the frequency. So this is pretty fundamental to the idea of a scale. All scales are kind of, at least as far as I know, all scales kind of fit within this sort of circular pattern of an octave. Okay, so if our scale is going to go between an octave, how do we make music out of that? We have 12 notes here. You can't really just choose random notes. I mean, you can choose random notes, but it doesn't sound like much. So how do we provide some structure to this such that we can make music out of it? And the first question that I kind of asked myself was, well, let's look at some other scales. Let's start with the major scale. So this is what the major scale sounds like. Right, that's like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So what are some other scales that we have? Some other scales that we have are the whole tone scale. Right, that's kind of like, this is like the dream sequence scale. But what I notice about this scale is that it doesn't really have, it's very symmetrical. There's right there, as you move around the scale and choose different notes from it, it feels very unsettled. There isn't like a very definitive home, and there isn't a very definitive resolution to this scale. And that's what kind of gives it its dreamlike quality. So let's look at another scale, and that's the diminished scale, or one of the diminished scales. There's two actually. So this scale is similar in that it is also very symmetrical, and in my opinion, it doesn't really have a resting place or a very defined center. Like these are chords that are made out of the diminished scale, and there's not really any like narrative in this scale. It's kind of a one-trick pony, right? Okay, so those are two different scales that might be contenders for this, and I would say that they don't have the primacy of the major scale because of the fact that they are a little too symmetrical. They don't really have any inbuilt sort of narratives in them, and they kind of just do this one thing. So the question that made me ask was, well, how are those scales constructed? In fact, their symmetry was sort of a clue as to this. So the whole tone scale is made exclusively of whole tones. And the diminished scale is based on minor thirds, with actually some half steps thrown in there. Right, so the next question that I asked was, well, let's try to make different scales based on one kind of interval. So let's try to make a scale just out of half steps. Right, that brings us back to just all the notes, and that doesn't really do anything that interesting. Now let's make a scale out of whole notes. Right, that brings us back to the whole tone scale. And that doesn't really do anything for us. Let's make a scale out of minor thirds, right? So what I'm noticing now is that all of these are actually symmetrical, and by that I mean they divide the octave perfectly evenly, right? So a chromatic scale or a half step scale is just 12 half steps, evenly divided into 12. Okay, a whole step scale, a whole tone scale is just 5 whole tones. An octave divided evenly into 5 whole tones. Minor thirds, there's 4, right? And they divide the octave evenly into 4. Okay, let's go to a major third. Same deal here. The octave is divided evenly into 3. Now something really interesting happens. We get to the fourth. Now, you may have noticed that we've now broken out of an octave. So what I'm going to do is every time I go out of the octave, I'm going to flip this note down an octave so that we normalize back into the same octave. So here's a fourth, here's another fourth, here's another fourth. Now that's broken out of the octave, so I'm going to flip it back in. So here's the E flat below that, up a fourth, up a fourth, and I'm going to flip that back down. So now we have, and then I'm going to go up another fourth. So this is kind of interesting, and if you've studied your music theory, you might recognize this. This is actually called the Locrian mode. Well, that's pretty interesting. What happens if we keep going? We get a C sharp, which is, or sorry, yeah, right, so we get a B natural. Okay, and what I notice here is that by the time we get to B, we've created a 3 half-step cycle. I think that's what I want to call that. So if we were to normalize that back in to the octave, and that's interesting. We don't actually see a lot of scales with 3 half-steps in a row. And I figured that was kind of like a stopping point. Okay, so once we hit 3 half-steps in a row, the structure kind of starts breaking down. So I'm going to stop there, actually. All right, having some technical issues, but that was a good place to put a pause as any. So we're going to continue on with the tritone. So what happens if we create a scale just out of the tritone? Well, once again, we get symmetry. Okay, so that's interesting. And again, doesn't really give us that much to work with harmonically. So let's keep going. Now let's do a perfect fifth. Okay, again, we're going to normalize this back down into 1 octave. So here's a fifth, another fifth, another fifth, another fifth, we're going to bring that back down, another fifth, another fifth, we're going to bring that back down. Okay, that's pretty interesting. And then again, if we go up another fifth, we're going to hit a C sharp and get another 3 half-step cycle. So we're going to stop there. And if you studied your music theory, you're going to recognize this. That is a Lydian mode. So we've stumbled across 2 recognizable modes if you know some music theory. And I'm actually going to stop there because what ends up happening is that after you get to the tritone, the scales that you come up with and the intervals actually become inversions of themselves. So for instance, a half step up is also a half step down, but or a half step up is an inverted major 7th, right? A whole step up is an inverted flat 7. A minor 3rd up is a major 6th. So basically what happens is we actually just get the same symmetrical scales if we do them with a flat 6, a major 6, flat 7, and major 7. And what is really, really interesting is this next part. All right, now for the really interesting part. So I'm going to show you a little algorithm that kind of unites the 2 modes that I just created out of stacking fourths and then stacking fifths. So remember when we stacked fourths and normalized them back into the same octave, we ended up with the Locrian mode, which is the 7th mode of the major scale. Then when we stacked fifths, we got the Lydian mode, which is the 4th mode of the major scale. So eventually, I noticed something really interesting. So let's start with the Lydian scale. Looks like this, right? Or Lydian mode looks like this. It's very similar to major, but has a sharp 4 here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do I guess it's a very simple algorithm, and I'm going to derive all the modes in all the scales with one simple trick. So what I'm going to do, here's Lydian. I'm going to start at the root, I'm going to go up a tritone, and I'm going to flat it, and then I'm going to play the rest of the notes as normal. Right, so I'm going to bring this down to here. So we just went from Lydian to major, or Ionian. So this is the note we just flatted. Now I'm going to go up a tritone from there, and I'm going to flat it. So B to B flat. What does that give us? Well, that gives us Mixolydian. So that's another mode. That's the 5th mode of the major scale. Okay, so I'm going to keep doing this. So I just flatted B to B flat. I'm going to go a tritone up from there, and I'm going to flat that. That gives us E flat. So where do we go from here? Well, that's Dorian. That's the 2nd mode of the major scale. Let's do it again. Up a tritone, and let's flat it. Okay, so what do we get? Well, that's minor, the 6th mode of the major scale. So do it again. We just went A flat, D, flat that. Phrygian, the 3rd mode of the major scale. So let's go a tritone up from here and flat that. Locrian, the 7th mode of the major scale. So let's go up from there. Just flatted this. Let's go up a tritone. Now it's at the root that we started on, and we flat that, and we get B. So something weird's just happened where our root changed, but now what does that give us? B Lydian. So now we started in C Lydian, we did this weird little tritone flatting algorithm, and eventually we found ourselves not only deriving all 7 modes from C Lydian, now we're at the Lydian a half step down. So if we kept doing that, what would happen? We would get all 7 modes from B Lydian, and then we'd go a half step down, and then we'd have all the modes of B flat. So this one simple rule, going up a tritone and flatting it, is eventually going to give us all 7 modes of all 7 keys. Or all 12 keys, pardon me. And I think that's pretty fucking interesting.